Hello and welcome to the screencast on writing objectives. We're going to talk a little bit about the relationship between objectives and goals and how to write well-constructed behavioral objectives that allow us to do a good job of measurement of progress. So what is an objective? A well-written objective assists you to focus your treatment on the key elements that you need in order to meet your long-term goal or outcome. So we have an objective. Some people call it a short-term goal. I prefer objective because then it doesn't get short-term goal, long-term goal. You don't get all of that kind of terminology all wrapped up as what is short-term and things like that. So I prefer to call it an objective. Some people might call it a short-term goal, but it should be measurable. Then once you have met your short-term goals, you would hope that that would lead to the meeting of long-term goals or outcomes. In adults, the term outcome is often used rather than long-term goal, and an outcome is actually a does or doesn't do kind of thing. So for example, the outcome might be that the client reports satisfaction when high levels of satisfaction when communicating with his family. Okay, that might be an outcome that you're looking for. And then you might have some kind of measure of satisfaction of communication. That would be your measure of the long term. Then you might have a short-term objective that is around some kind of very specific skill that is getting in the way of that communication, like maybe it's spoken output and naming or something like that. The idea would be that your short-term objectives would, as they are met, lead toward that ultimate outcome. It might help you to, these objectives might help you to select materials and content and help you in what procedures to use, but they are not those things, which we're going to talk about in a second. But they might help you to select some of them. And they measure if the target behavior has occurred and with what level of proficiency it has occurred. An objective is not the treatment. If all of you're doing is doing the objective over and over and over and over again 20 times in a session, you're not really providing any therapeutic intervention. The idea is that the objective is what you're trying to get the person to do, and that you're taking data on that, and you're taking data on a specific condition within that therapeutic approach, but that is not the sum and total of the treatment. It isn't the treatment procedure. It isn't the outline of materials. You don't want your objective to be so specific that it just focuses you in on a, one set of materials. So you might say something like, we'll be able to produce, maybe we'll be able to say 3 to 4 words in a sentence, given a picture stimuli, that would be okay, right? We know that you're going to use a picture, but to say that it's going to be a picture of only one thing would narrow you in too much. And then it's not a demonstration of skilled intervention. So the objective alone does not make what you're doing skilled, and what you're doing needs to be skilled in order for it to be reimbursed by any third-party payer or any government agency, including, for those of you who want to work in public schools, IDEA. We need to have skilled interventions going on. So an objective can be thought of as a noun, a verb, an adjective, and an adverb group. That's one way of thinking about it. On the next slide, we're going to see how it's more commonly talked about, but the idea here is that there are different ways to conceptualize the parts of the objective, but that those parts need to be there. There need to be 3 parts to the objective. A performance component, that could be thought of as the verb. Okay? The condition component, that's what condition will be imposed on the client. That could be thought of as the adjective. And the criterion component, that's how the performance will be evaluated, or the adverb. I'd like to add a 4th, which is the rationale. If you start your objective with the rationale, it'll save you a great deal in the narrative writing that you do around the objective. So for example, to increase the ability to read for paying bills, and other financial functions. The client will, and now you take off with your objective. Now we know the purpose of whatever it is that you're doing with this client. We know that your long-term outcome or your long-term goal or your rationale for doing it is that the patient will get better at doing their own finances. Okay, so let's take the objective apart. The performance component is also sometimes called the do statement. The performance component must identify what the person you are assessing will do, and it should be something that you can see, hear, touch, taste, or smell. But because we don't touch, taste, or smell our patients, it really is about what you as the clinician can see or what you can hear. It should be countable in some way, okay? And the verb is the key. The verb will drive your data collection. Whenever I have a student who says, "Oh gosh, I don't know how I'm taking my data," I'm like, "What's your verb?" That's what you're taking your data on. Many times I'll go back and say, "Oh, I don't have a well enough defined condition," or "I don't have a well enough defined verb in my objective." That's why I keep switching the way I'm doing my data collection, because one day I'm collecting it on one thing and one day I'm collecting it on another thing because it isn't specific enough in my objective. So I want you to pay particular attention to the words to avoid from Meyer. Okay, well, feel, you might think, oh yeah, feel, of course I would never use that. Believe, oh, I would never use that as a verb, okay? But in this next list, you're going to see some that you have seen used and that you might yourself have used. Know, plan, understand, use, okay? Another one that I would put on this list is identify. Some people think that identify means that you say it. Some people think that identify means that you point to it. So just use point or say. Tell us how they will identify. So from this list, I would add also the term identify. So these words in yellow are ones I've commonly seen in SLP objectives, and I want to particularly point out the word use. When you write an objective for me, I should never see the word use in the objective. You have to tell me how they'll use it. Will they use it by saying something? Will they use it by pointing to something? Will they use it by manipulating something or picking something up? Is that what you're talking about? Define use. Instead of using use a different verb that you can see or hear. So, what verbs should you use? Meyer suggests some of these. Say. I love say. Why do we have to say verbalize? Why do we have to say will state? Why can't you just say the client will say? They will say their name. They will say the name of their family members. They will say the name of a pictured object. It's so simple. Just use say. Just don't make it hard. They'll write. They'll tell. They'll repeat. Okay. Recite. That kind of is, similar to repeat in my mind. Point. Fold. Draw. These are all things that are very, very measurable. These are the kinds of verbs to use. So, as we talk about this, we could think about the previous two slides as the first group of slides being covert verbs and the second slide being overt verbs. Overt verbs can be seen or heard. Covert verbs are not directly observable, but are represented when someone says or does something. So if you want to let people know that, yes, the client is saying something, but what I'm really measuring is their ability to analyze, then you would use the term, you could use the verb analyze, but then you're going to use this thing called an indicator to tell us how you will know they analyzed, or how you will know they recalled, or how you will know they identified. Okay? So if you can't use an overt verb and you have to use a covert verb, you're going to need to use an indicator. So here are some examples. So let's say that we were writing an objective that said Johnny will be able to identify the names of family. The covert verb is identify, and the indicator is say the name. And I'm sorry, as this comes in with these animations, it's covered up a little bit, but that says say the name is the indicator. Okay, so here's another example. Let's say that we want Johnny to recall. So we're trying to get at the fact that this is a memory thing. So Johnny will be able to recall, that is, write the data, the day, date, and year. So we know that it's something written, not something spoken. So the covert verb is recall, and the indicator is write the data. So here are some examples of performance components. The person will state their name, they'll name pictures, they'll use appropriate pitch, they'll produce easy onset, they'll read aloud, they'll point to pictures, they'll say their address. So these are examples of performance components. Now let's talk about the condition. The condition is the adjective component of the objective. It's the conditions that will be imposed on the person. It includes things like what input you will give them. So given a pen and paper, or given a set of 4 possible answers, or given 3 opportunities. Then it also might talk about what you will deny the learner if what's important to the objective is that they're not going to have access to something. So without visual support might be an example. It might be where the behavior will be performed. At school, at family gatherings, at lunchtime, right? So that idea of where the behavior will be performed. And then it might also include in whose presence it will be performed. So with other peers, with family, with unknown communication partners. Now, not all of these have to be in place. Not all of these have to be in place. You have to identify through your critical thinking, remember your critical thinking, what the key components are here that are important to keep track of, because they might influence the outcome based on what you know about this particular case. The condition component should assist anyone to understand and replicate what you're doing. It should make the objective more clear, and it should assist you in your data collection. So if you say the client will point to pictures, and then they don't point to pictures, but it wasn't really an appropriate time to point to pictures, and you don't know what to do with that data. So if you have a condition statement in there that says we'll point to pictures when available pictures communicate the appropriate response, now we've got it, right? Now we know when we're supposed to be doing it. And that example is probably a little bit AAC-ish, but certainly the condition statement should help you to make decisions about data collection. So Major suggests that you ask yourself the following questions as you think about the condition component. What will the learner be allowed to use? And the learner in this case could be an adult with an acquired neurogenic communication disorder. What will the learner be denied? In other words, is there something that normally they would have that they're not going to have, or that they've had in the past that they're not going to have now? Under what conditions would you expect the desired performance to occur? Right? So what's the conditions, and are there any skills that you specifically you're not trying to develop, and does the objective then exclude those skills? Here's some additional questions. Are there special materials that will be used that wouldn't generally be available? Will a compensatory strategy be used? If so, list them. Right? If they're going to do this, but they're going to do this by using a compensatory strategy to do it, that should be in your objective, so everyone knows that they're using the strategy. Will there be any assistance provided by the clinician or by a caregiver? If so, that needs to be in the objective so that we know that this isn't an independent condition. And how many items will be presented to the person at one time? So if you're talking about doing some kind of pointing task, or you're going to have them doing some kind of picking from amongst a group, how big is the group? Is it 2 things? Is it 10 things? Is it 15 things? All of those things will impact, right, how difficult the task is. So here are some examples of conditions, general conditions in the initial position of words. Very important in our TIC that you identify where the sound will be produced. In multisyllabic words, with his spouse, when prompted, when cued, without a dictionary, with a resource guide, with a phonemic cue, with instruction for rate control, while prolonging an ah, in a field of 4 choices, when given a communication board, independently, right? Just telling everybody that they're going to do this without any supports, without assistance, again, no supports, spontaneously, which means you're not even going to set them up. You're just looking for this to naturally occur in the natural environment. Okay, which is the difference between spontaneously and independently. Independently means they had set up and the context itself told them to do it. So for example, if I have a person who's going to be following directions, right, I give them a list of directions. I say point to your nose. That's the only thing happening in the environment, right? That's independently. Spontaneously would be if they were in their kitchen and their wife said, hand me a fork, and they reached in the drawer and handed her a fork. That'd be spontaneously, because there's no setup to it. It's not within that, you know, kind of therapeutic setup. Okay, so here's an example of the condition component. John will name household objects presented one at a time with 85% accuracy, or John will name household objects while scanning the room with 85% accuracy. You can see that that's different. In one condition, the clinician is holding up the object and saying, tell me what this is. In the other, the clinician saying, look around the room and name as many things as you can, right? So he's scanning the room. You're going to get different data for those different conditions, so you need to know what your condition is that you're measuring. Now I want to talk about the criterion component. This is the way that the person's performance will be measured. It's the adverb statement of the objective if you think in that way. It's not always measured in percentages. There are plenty of things that cannot be measured in percentages. And it's not always about accuracy. Sometimes it's just about doing a thing. You don't have to do it accurately, you just need to do it. Okay? It states how and when the objective will be met, and it should be something that you can measure and compare. So I want to go back to this idea of accuracy, and I'm going to give an example from traumatic brain injury. If I have a person who has very, very poor attention, and what I want them to do is just attend to the fact that there's been a question and respond to the question, then I might say that the person will respond to questions 80% of the time, because I'm really working on attention, right? But I don't care whether or not the answer that they give me is accurate. I want them to attend that there has been a question and to understand that it was a question and that it requires a response from them. That's the target, not how accurate it was. So be sure, this is another area where people run into a lot of trouble. They have their objectives set for accuracy, but really what they're measuring is compliance, or that they just did the skill. And that's usually, instead of saying with 80% accuracy, it's usually said 90% of the time. They'll do it 90% of the time, not necessarily with accuracy. Major indicates that there is usually, there can be a measure of accuracy, speed, so for example 110 words per minute, or 6 items in 1 minute, or we'll name 2 items in 30 seconds, something like that. Quality, with less than 2 errors of syntax in a 5-minute conversation. And additionally, occurrence may be tracked 80% of the time, or in 3 of 4 trials, or 3 times in 5 minutes. I call this 3 times in 5 minutes. I call that opportunity per time, right? Or number per time, sorry, number per time. And I want you to do it a certain number in a certain amount of time, number per time. Common ways that we measure things. When considering the criterion, you need to choose the best measurement for the situation. If you use percent, you need to have at least 10 opportunities. More than 10 is desirable, but because the more opportunities that you are measuring, the more reliable your data is and the less prone to error it is. If you use trials, you're defining how many times you'll present the stimuli, and you must get that many trials every time you measure. So if you say I'm going to get 3 out of 5, I want him to do it in 3 out of 5 trials, right? You're saying you're going to elicit 5 trials. Always elicit 5 trials. Don't elicit 4, because now you can't report your data. It's really important that if you're going to do it number of trials, 2 out of 5 trials, 3 out of 7 trials, because you don't have 10 opportunities and you're going to do this per trial thing, that you get that many trials. It has to be a number that you can get. To set criterions, you need the following information. Before you set the criterion, do not ever automatically set a criterion at 80%. Ever. Automatically set a criterion at 80%. That is folklore. Don't do it. To set the criterion, you have to know the performance at baseline. So if the patient started at 85%, it would make no sense to set the baseline at 80%. So you need to know the baseline before you start and set the criterion. You have to establish the baseline. You have to have the baseline set before you set the criterion. I can't tell you how many times I've had a student set the criterion for 70% and then come to me later and say, well, you know how I set the criterion at 70%? Well, it turns out that actually I messed up and they started out at 80%. Well, you can't start at 80% and set the criterion that you want them to get to 70%, because what you're telling everybody is I'm going to make the patient worse. So you've got to set that baseline. You need to say how long it will be until the objective is evaluated again. When will you need to take that into account? So are you setting a criterion for where this person will be in 6 months? Or are you setting this criterion for where they'll be in 3 months? Or are you setting this criterion for where they will be in a week? That will change where you set the criterion. So if they started at baseline at 60% and you're going to report back in a week, you're probably not going to get to 80 or 90%. Right? So you have to think about how long will it be until you have to report back on this objective. How much assistance is being given? You can expect to make more progress if you're giving assistance than if you're asking the patient to be independent. So you might set the criterion a little higher if this is a cued condition versus an independent condition. What was the previous progress of this patient? So what's their history of progress? Have they made a lot of progress very quickly? They're maybe relatively not that far post-onset, so they've got a lot of spontaneous recovery. You would set the criterion higher than if you've had someone who's made slow, steady gains, but not a tremendous amount. So they tend to go up 5 to 10% in a 30-day period. Then you know that that's kind of their pattern if you've seen them in the past. So then you would use that to help you set the criterion. You want to think about their overall prognosis. So what's their age? What's the extent of their neurological damage? What's their educational level? You put that all in a pot and you say, this person has a really good prognosis. They can probably make more gains than this person over here who has a lot more neurological damage and has some other factors working against them. And then the intensity of the treatment. You can expect that a patient that you see 2 times a week will make less progress than somebody you see 5 times a week in that same progress period. So if you're reporting back in a month, you've got 30 days. Then if you're seeing this person 5 days a week for an hour, you would expect to make more progress than if you're seeing a different or that same person for 2 days a week for an hour, because you just don't have the same intensity of treatment. So I think of it like I think about it actually in hours. So if I know that I have to report back in 90 days and I know I see this person one time a week, and that is approximately 4 weeks, 3 sets of 4 weeks for 90 days, 30 days a month, right? So 12 weeks, one time a week, that's 12 sessions. I have 4 different things I'm working on, so within those 12 sessions, I'm really only getting about 3 hours of treatment on that particular thing. I'm not going to expect as much progress in that formula as I would in others. So, think about some additional things to think about is the level of skill that the person needs to move to the next step. So if your long-term outcome is being able to participate in some of their financial management, what level of skill will they need? And so where do they need to get? Do they need to be 100% or can they get away with being 90%? Generally, we don't set things at 100% because none of us are 100%, but do they need to be at like 95% accurate? Or if they're 80% accurate, is that good enough? And then how much competency do they need to be feel reasonably comfortable that they're ready for discharge? From these factors, you're going to make an educated guess regarding where the patient will likely be at the end of the reporting period. Remember that in adult rehabilitation, the objectives need to be made within the progress period. So you're being told when you're going to have to report back on this. For Medicare, it's often 60 or 90 days, for example. But for other insurers, it might be a different time period. So you would like to come to the payer and say the objective was met. So set the criterion so the person can meet it within the time period. That means you may say, I only think they can get to 70%. They started at 60, I think they can only get to 70% because I'm only going to see them 4 times, right? Don't set it at 80 automatically and then have to go to the insurance company and say, yeah, I didn't meet it because somebody magically told me that 80% was the magic, because it's not. This is how we set criterions. We do it in a skilled way. Okay, so here are some examples of criterion components. The person will do it in 3 out of 4 sessions. They'll do it for 5 minutes. They'll do it 80% of the time. They'll do it with 95% accuracy. They'll do they'll do it in 3 conversational terms. They'll do it 4 times in 1 minute. They'll do it in 3 out of 5 trials. They'll do it 3 consecutive times. So those are all examples of different ways to write criterion components. Okay, so I'm going to do a few quick examples. I know this is going a little long. John, that's the noun, will answer true-false questions by circling answers. So I have a performance component with an indicator because this is a covert verb. Will answer. Answer is covert. About a 3 to 5 word newspaper headline from the daily paper. Condition component with 85% accuracy, and that's my criterion. In this case, John will, it's our noun, read words aloud, it's a performance component. After a reminder of intelligibility strategies by the clinician, with 75% intelligibility as judged by a naive speaker. Okay, in this case, this would be a motor speech objective, not a language objective. Okay, so the information that I provided here has come from these sources. I know that this webcast went a little long, but I just really wanted to be sure that you were well steeped in how to get these objectives written and to look at them from an adult perspective. Thank you very much for your time, and goodbye.